Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's truly an honor to present my work in this forum. My name is Madalina Vlasceanu. Like Scott said, I'm a new assistant professor in environmental behavioral sciences here at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And today I would like to give you just a brief flavor of my lab's research program, which is centered around this question of how climate action can be catalyzed. And this question stems from a puzzle that has long perplexed researchers. And so what the data show is that most people are very concerned about climate change. We can see that in the yearly Yale climate opinion maps. We can see that in some of my own data. We collected this data set last year in 63 countries. And what we find is that the degree of belief in the climate emergency is at 86%. Despite this, the data also show that very few people are taking actions needed to address the risk that they perceive. So only about 10% of people are doing things like contact their representative to voice their climate concern. And not only are we not acting on our climate beliefs and concerns, but some of us are actively undermining climate solution, and this is perhaps more concerning. So what we now observe is that local opposition is a leading cause of canceled clean energy projects. So why is that? This doesn't make sense in light of the, at least until a couple decades ago, dominant view of behavior, which used to be the rational agent model. And so in order to answer this question, in today's talk, I will walk you through some foundational principles from psychology. And towards the end, I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of studies that we conducted in my lab in which we bridge these foundational principles with climate solutions to try to answer this question. And I myself started getting interested in this question and started getting hints as to what might be going on here when I was in graduate school at Princeton, and I was doing my PhD, and in the process I was teaching this class called The Psychological Foundations of Public Policy. This had been developed in that department by Daniel Kahneman a couple years prior. And I'll give you just a couple examples from insights I took from that class, because I think it answers this question I posed at the beginning. So let's start with the very lowest level that we can think of perception. So how many of you in this room perceive squares A and B in this picture to be different colors? Just raise your hand. Everybody. So you perceive these two squares to be different. They're in fact the exact same color. They are comprised of the same pixels. But you actually see them as different because of the context in which they appear. If I remove that context by just cropping this photo, you all of a sudden can now see reality as it truly existed in the world the entire time. Let's take another example in which your brain is playing tricks on you. This time at a higher level than perception, let's think about decision making. So we're going to go through a scenario in which there's a new disease. It affects 600 people, and you have to choose between two treatments. In treatment A, you for sure save 200 people. In treatment B, this is equivalent in expectation, but it's riskier. So there's a 33% chance you save everyone, 66% chance you save no one. Which one would you choose? Think about it. It turns out most people, when faced with this choice, go with the first option. We're risk averse when the two options are framed in terms of what you can gain from them. But let's think about the exact same two options, the same two treatments, and this time I'll tell you about what you stand to lose from each of them. So in treatment A, 400 people will die, right? This is treatment A all along, but now you're being told that this is what treatment A does. Treatment B, the flip side probability, 33% chance no one will die, 66% chance everyone will die. All of a sudden now everybody goes with the riskier option, even though they're the same two options. So this example illustrates how we make very different decisions depending on how our choice set is being framed. And here's the last example I'll talk about today. This is from collective decision makers, so even higher level. So what you can see here are organ donation rates in different countries. And what you can observe is that in countries like Sweden, almost everybody is an organ donor. In countries like Denmark, almost nobody is an organ donor. Why? What is the difference between these two countries, between these two types of countries? And so here the point of this example is to say that collectively we make very different choices depending on the system in which we find ourselves. And it just so happens that in Denmark, there's an opt-in to become a donor system. And in Sweden, it just so happens to be an opt-out, and people stick to the default no matter what that is. Of course, after this was documented, a lot of governments switched their default immediately. So what are all of these examples of very inconsistent decision-making, of framing effect, context effects impacting our decisions? What do all of them have in common with each other at a theoretical level? And how can they help us explain why we don't act on climate despite being concerned? And today I would like to propose that the answer relies on the very simple but profound fact that was actually formalized by Kahneman and Tversky in the 70s, that our minds don't simply observe reality in the way it exists in the world. Instead, what the mind does is construes that reality into mental representations. And there is not a one-to-one correspondence between what's really there physically in the world and what your brain represents that information to be. So that means that if you receive climate change information, for example, we'll receive a lot of climate change information throughout today's talks, but if your brain represents that information to mean climate change is this psychologically distant phenomenon, it will not affect me, then you're going to be less likely to act than if you represent the exact same information as this is very relevant to me, it's nearby, psychologically close, then I'm going to be more likely to act. So this observation really stands to reason, and it really is based off of the distinction between the rational agent model, which I mentioned used to be the dominant view of human behavior. And in this view, what we notice is that the assumption is that people mostly engage in these processing that are characterized by slow, deliberative, and logical type of processes. This type of agent displays consistent preferences, consistent choices, is predictable, and always acts in self-interest. So for example, it would always act on climate when given the option. In contrast, what psychology has proposed is that we also engage at times in a faster type of processing, a more automatic, associative, emotional type of decision-making. This agent also displays inconsistent preferences and choices, is unpredictable, does not always act in self-interest. Sometimes context matters, framing matters. And this model is more aligned with empirical data in a lot of contexts, especially when we're talking about climate change. So our lab is trying to understand the behavioral model because we assume that as our community and others come up with technologies and policies to advance climate adaptation and mitigation, we also in parallel need to understand how decision makers will choose to interact with these innovations by either implementing them or by rejecting them, as we've seen at the beginning. And this will purely depend on how the public chooses to construe these innovations. And so unless we understand how the public construes these, we tend to make wrong assumptions about the decision makers, which can lead to failed solutions. So this idea became really popular in a lot of domains. We're applying it to climate change, but it really took off in a lot of other domains around the world, and it became really popular when the book Nudge was first published in 2009. And at the time, a lot of governments got really excited. They started entire nudge units in governments around the world where they started taking psychological insights and applying them to improve public policy. And this trend you can see here was really taking off in the years 2015, 2020, when I was in graduate school. So that really inspired me. It became such an amazing opportunity to have psychology and behavioral sciences make a tangible and scalable impact. So that's when I decided I would try to do research that would have policy relevance. That was likely the experience of many others. So in the past decade or so, there has been a plethora of research on the psychological barriers to climate action based on the behavioral model and how removing those barriers in interventions can lead to action. And these barriers, you can think of them at the individual level, so barriers within our minds, but they also exist at the collective and at the system level. So a couple of examples. We have cognitive barriers to action. For example, misinformation about scientific consensus. There are social barriers to action, such as pluralistic ignorance. This means that we underestimate other people's climate concern. We underestimate other people's climate actions. There are affective barriers. This is because we construe climate change as psychologically distant, so that worries us less. There are political barriers driven by growing polarization, structural barriers driven by missing infrastructure, and actually many, many others. So what the question was when I started my first lab was, which of these barriers should policy prioritize? How do they compare with each other? Which of them is more effective when removed? Or which of them is more effective in which context? So in the first study I would like to walk you through today at the individual level, what we did was we asked, how can we catalyze individual level climate action? And we operationalized that as support for climate policy, such as renewable energy projects and information sharing. And we crowdsourced from a large sample of 255 behavioral scientists the interventions that were most promising at the time. These had all been published before and were shown to be effective in this context, but they had never been tested against each other in like a tournament style. And so that's what we did. And these interventions ranged all the way from correcting misperceptions about scientific consensus, to emphasizing social norms, to decreasing the psychological distance of climate impacts, to decreasing the psychological distance of the climate actions we can take today on the future generation. In total, we tested 11 interventions, and these are all theoretically driven, and we collected a large sample of 60,000 participants from 63 countries. And we randomly assigned these participants to only one of these interventions or a control condition. And what we found is that for policy support, the top intervention framed climate action in terms of its impact on the future generation. So here our participants were compelled to think about what are the climate actions today to make sure the planet is still habitable for the future generation. When we looked at information sharing, a very different intervention, so a different mechanism, led to the most sharing. And this relied on negative emotion induction by presenting participants with information about climate change consequences. So at this individual level of analysis, when we think about individual level action, we've identified out of almost all of the psychologically, theoretically driven interventions aimed at increasing these types of actions, that the two most promising mechanisms rely on decreasing the social psychological distance of climate actions and their impacts on the future generation, as well as talking about climate change impacts, as we'll hear later today in the talks, which happens to induce negative emotion. So here, after this study, we took a step back and we thought individual level action is not enough to address climate change. We, of course, need that to be complemented by system and structural changes. And in our lab, we think about how can public pressure instigate some of these systemic changes. And so in our second study that I'll talk about today, we asked how can collective climate action be catalyzed? And that's of the sort public, political, or financial advocacy. This study was led by my graduate student, Danielle Goldworth. And what Danielle did is, similarly to the first study, crowdsourced from a large number of experts theoretically driven interventions that had been shown in prior work to increase collective climate action. And we recruited a sample of 31,000 US residents and randomly assigned them to one of the 17 interventions or a control condition. And these interventions ranged from policy literacy programs to emphasizing the co-benefits of engaging in collective action, such as benefits to the economy. You can think about this as the gains frame. We also tested a losses frame. For example, if we don't act, we stand to lose things like public health disasters might happen. We talked a lot about social norms or, again, the future generation framing. And what we found is that in the context of collective action, the top psychological mechanism that nudges this type of behavior relies on emphasizing the efficacy of collective action and the positive emotional benefits. So much more positive compared to the negative emotions that works on individual level action that we see in the previous study. A second closed mechanism here emphasizing binding moral foundations. That means talking about climate actions in terms of preserving the purity and sanctity of the environment. So at this collective level, the top psychological mechanisms that incentivize collective level climate action rely on collective efficacy and binding moral foundations. So the final study I want to really briefly mention that we conducted is at the system level. And here we wanted to see whether we can increase participation in the electoral process. We chose to study this in the context of voter registration ahead of the 2024 presidential election in the United States. So we asked, how can system action be catalyzed? This project was led by 2 graduate students, Katie Mason and Kaylee Oakst. And similarly, we identified 10 behavioral interventions that had been shown in prior work to be effective at influencing system-level behaviors, such as voting. And we recruited a sample of 16,000 unregistered voters ahead of that election. And the interventions ranged from public pressure campaigns to implementation intentions or patriotic framing. And what we found is that the patriotic framing was the top intervention that incentivized voter registration the most. So at the system level, the takeaway is that instead of framing climate solutions as a way to let's burn down the system, burn down the house, and build from scratch, people are way more receptive to a system-enhancing solutions, the same solution if it's framed in that way. So bringing it all the way back, my hope is that with these types of projects and insights, in collaboration with policymakers and practitioners, we can frame climate solutions in the way that leads to the highest degree of public acceptance in communities. And what I'm really excited about in the future is to integrate additional interdisciplinary approaches with this work for our shared mission of increasing the implementation of successful climate solutions. Thank you for your attention.